We have Patrick Findaro here, co-founder at Vetted Biz. Excited to have on Richard Stroiney, who's the CEO of the American Association of Franchisees and Dealers, also known as AAFD. Richard and I met back at their leadership conference in September of last year, 2022. Was very impressed by the organization, the speakers, the delegates. Richard, thanks a lot for joining today.
No, thanks for having me here, Patrick.
So, Richard, you have quite the journey as an entrepreneur, even a franchisee of BNI. Could you tell us a little bit about your path in entrepreneurship and how you ended up as the CEO of the AAFD?
Sure. If you remember 2008, 2009, we had that economic downturn, and I was in corporate America at the time. It was interesting because my boss at the time called me in his office to give me my pink slip, and I actually thanked him because I had just spent about, I think it was 20 years in corporate America, and I didn't see the journey for me anymore. That actually allowed me to sign up for my first franchise, which was an Action Coach franchise. So central to who I am today and what you'll hear probably a lot throughout this discussion is coaching is important to me, and how you work with businesses is important. So I started with Action Coach. That was my first franchise. They told me to join a BNI chapter, Business Network International chapter. So I joined one in my area. I was a member since 2009 all the way through 2022. During that time, I served in a bunch of leadership capacities in the chapter and then started working for the franchisee herself. But then in 2014, the opportunity came around for me to buy the franchise in BNI. So I bought the Connecticut franchise, and then I expanded to a Western Mass portion of the franchise. So I served as the franchise owner until 2021. The end of April, I sold it as the second largest U.S. franchise. I spent about a year just kind of getting back into the coaching arena. And then the executive director for the AAFD stepped away from the business to work a different opportunity. And Bob Pervin, who's now the chairman of the board of trustees for the AAFD, he asked if I'd like to come on board as the chief operating officer and executive director. So that was my first foray into the AAFD as an employee. But prior to that, when I was a BNI franchisee, I was actually a member of the chapter representing BNI franchisees. So in that chapter, I served as vice president, president. I was on the board of directors and also the legal trust fund trustee. So I served in a lot of the roles with the AAFD, so I got to know it from the inside out. And when Bob reached out to me, I didn't hesitate, and it became an amazing opportunity. So I spent about a year in the COO role. And then this past May, I should say, Bob asked me to step into the CEO role. He's not retiring, but he saw an opportunity for him to just focus on some other opportunities, especially the legal side of the AAFD. And so I took on the day-to-day operations and long-term planning. So that's kind of the story of me stepping into the AAFD, which, again, 2 franchise systems later, here I am.
Yeah, I love your career trajectory because it's how people ideally should be getting into franchising, where you already have a relationship with the organization, whether it's as a customer, vendor, or you're an employee.
Yep.
And you know the organization, the culture, their modus operandi. And after some time, it made sense to become a franchisee, but you knew exactly what you were getting into before you signed that contract. And much more important than the financial commitment, dedicate your life to running a BNI chapter, a large BNI chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say that I'm an engineering by undergraduate. So I'd like to take things apart, or I like to understand things from the ground up. And so I think that's one of those intrinsic traits of mine, which is I've got to understand it before I can really understand it and be involved with it. And both for BNI and the AFD, that certainly was the case because I kind of grew up in the organization first. And I still tell chapters as we're having the initial conversations with the ones that may want to form, I said, I'm still a member. My BNI chapter still allows me, even though I'm the CEO of the AFD, to remain a member of the chapter and support my fellow former BNI franchisees. And I love it. It's a great opportunity to stay connected to franchising, but also support my former peers who are still amazing people.
Yeah, BNI, you went from being a customer of the product or a member essentially, but then to employee, then to owner, and then back to being a member.
Yes. So when I sold my franchise, I just reverted back to membership in my original chapter. And I was there for, I think it was another year following the sale. I told my chapter, I still believe in it. I still want to be part of it. And I still enjoy meeting, right? Again, it's the people, right? And interacting and finding ways to help them be successful with what they're trying to accomplish. And again, they permitted it, which is always good.
Yeah. You want to have everyone on board. One thing
Sure.
that we've seen, Richard, and what we're looking more at Vetted Biz is the coverage ratio of corporate employees to franchisees. And some of those corporate employees could be essentially coaches or different roles that will go on site and help accelerate the work of the franchise. And as we know, some of the franchise organizations have never met someone within the organization that's supposed to be helping them, or there's not even that role. And there's
Sure.
one corporate employee per 40 franchisees. So there's no way in the current state of that franchise system that they can have that coaching and mentorship experience. Why is that vital? And what do you see for those franchise organizations that don't offer that currently? And if it's not offered, what are some resources that a franchisee can tap into?
So let's face it, everybody needs help at some point in their life, right? And sometimes many points in their life. It just depends what they're trying to accomplish personally, professionally, spiritually, whatever it is, right? And I think that's the true benefit of coaching and the mentoring. For franchisees, I think it's even more critical because the array of backgrounds and experiences of the people who become franchisees is so varied, right? And I would highly encourage franchisors to look for ways to have a true mentorship or coaching engagement with their franchisees. My first thought is it can only help, right? Yes, it's an expense, but if your franchisees have the skill set they need beyond the franchisee training, which is more the operational side of running the business, it gives them an opportunity to be successful and or understand where their weaknesses are. And I think that's one of the challenges of many of us who resist the coaching and mentoring, right? And I'll include myself as one of those too. I know when I first became a coach, I had a coach and I resisted.
Why
It's
do
our
people
nature.
resist?
It's the willingness to want to be coached. It's the interest in getting the feedback that you don't want to hear and forgetting that feedback itself is a blessing, right? If someone wants to give you feedback, that means they're trying to help you. Now, we all have to be open to receiving feedback. And that's one of those things that you have to learn. If you're going to share feedback, you've got to get that permission to share it. But at the end of the day, it's the willingness to be told what you don't want to hear and the willingness to be accountable to someone that you respect. And I think that's the other key here, certainly from a coaching and mentoring program. You can't just assign a coach or a mentor. I've seen franchise systems say, okay, this is your franchisee coach, and they've got 15, 20, 30 franchisees to a particular person to help coach them. But to be coached effectively, you have to respect the person coaching you, and you've got to feel as though they've been in your shoes. Now, in the franchisor world, that means you have to find someone who has that franchising experience. Yeah. Not always possible, but at least someone having that business background or experience in the area where that individual needs help, right? And I think that's the key for anyone who might want to consider coaching or mentoring, right? It's find the person that you don't want to let down. Find the person that you're willing to accept that tough feedback and also have them keep you accountable to yourself for what you want to accomplish. That's coaching, right? You and I had talked before this of course, but that's the key. It's my job isn't to tell you what to do. My job as a coach is to guide you down the path that you know you should be on, but to help you get there on your own thought process, if you will. Ultimately, you've got to figure out where you want to go because it's your business, it's your focus, it's your weaknesses that have to be addressed. And again, if the franchisors can find a method, and there are a number of coaching companies out there that I'm sure would love to work with franchisors that can help the franchisees. With that said, I would encourage the franchisees themselves to find a coach or a mentor or someone. I found great support within BNI, if you will, from the other more established franchisees. Again, I started in 2014. There were franchisees that have been in place for 10, 15, 20 years prior to me. And those are the ones that I reached out to when I needed help, wanted advice. Said, hey, can you make sure that I'm focused on this, right? Those are the ones I didn't want to let down because they were my peers. And they were the peers that were successful and who I wanted to emulate. I'd say that's probably the biggest suggestion I could give to both franchisees and franchisors, right? Have something in place to help, whether it's for yourself as a franchisee or the franchisors. Again, the franchisor can only help improve the overall system if your franchisees are successful.
And it sounds like a big part of that's just communication and the franchisor cultivating the opportunity for newer franchisees to feel comfortable reaching out to more experienced ones, and more experienced franchisees having some sort of benefit. It could just be an emotional benefit, not financial at all, but that right. They're giving back to the organization for the greater good of the brand and the greater good of the communities too that they serve.
So yeah, and I know that there's some franchise systems, BNI included, that had like a mastery circle group where a group of franchisees would get together. They had to qualify to be in this group, but they would get together and share those ideas and best practices and suggestions to the franchisor. So it exists out there to have that collective dialogue within the franchisor's umbrella. I just don't think it's utilized nearly enough, and I think it's even easier to do it nowadays that we have these virtual meetings, right? We don't have to travel to get to places, albeit it's better to be in person. You create stronger bonds, but
if you were
can
like
have these
an hour of us, I would say, let's meet at one of our offices and we'll shoot it in person.
Yeah.
BNI. So taking a step back, what is BNI for those that aren't familiar with it?
BNI is a business networking organization where groups of professionals get together on a weekly basis. And I'll use my own experience as an example. My chapter met at 7 a.m. every Thursday morning. We met for 90 minutes with a very established agenda to follow. So we would share those areas where we would love for a great referral or business opportunities. We'd reach out to the group as a total and their connections to say, hey, I may need connection to, let's say, a CPA as a business coach. And I would target specific CPAs. And if they had connections, they would feel willing to open up their Rolodex, if you will, using that aged term, open up their contacts and create a connection for me. But they would only do that if I built the trust and credibility with them individually, right? Because our networks behind us are an extreme value to us. And we won't just give those away. People have to earn the right to access those. But that's what BNI is. We build the credibility and trust amongst each other. And then we ask for help in creating connections or sharing successes or even some of the business practices that make sense. And the benefit of BNI for those listening is you can only have one person per profession. So you would only have one financial advisor, one business coach, one realtor. And that's really the business or the benefit, because you're not competing within this group. It's complementary to what everybody's trying to accomplish, which is expanding our networks. So I'm a firm believer that new business owners, individuals graduating from college, getting into the business community or business world should do it. And even those that are established that just want to expand their footprint. I'm an advocate even to this day, 2-3 years after selling my own franchise. It makes sense and it works. I'm an example of that, if you will.
Well, the testament that you've been part of the organization for, 13 years, 14 years in various capacities, that's a testament in of itself. You clearly have a strong aptitude for relationships, networking, and one relationship that should be very strong, but is fragile at times is the franchisee, franchisor, licensor, licensee relationship. That I've heard amazing stories, and I've also heard horror stories that end up in the courtrooms. How do you and the AAFD organization help facilitate for better communication, collaboration between the franchisor and the franchisee?
Yeah, so we see a lot whenever a chapter forms, the franchisor gets nervous. They think that there's this new group that's going to destroy the franchise system. And in reality, the franchisees don't want that. Franchisees ultimately want to help the franchisor to be successful, because that's how together the system can really expand and grow and benefit everybody. I think that one of the biggest benefits that the franchisor forgets is that a chapter forming creates a common voice or a collective voice. Now, there's certainly negative connotations to that, but if you look at the positive, that you have one group of people that you can reach out to directly versus reaching out to all the franchisees, right? So again, I'll use the BNI example. We had well over 100 individual franchisees in our system. And if you think about the benefit of the franchisor having the ability to go to one group, the president or vice president of this association chapter, and say, hey, we need help with this, or we're looking to improve this area, or we need ideas along these lines. What an opportunity for that, right? And if you think about it, the franchisors who get it could use this as an amazing tool, right? An advisory group that they don't even have to pay for, but is fully invested in the success of the franchise system, right? And I think that's the messaging I'm trying to get across as I'm speaking with the chapters that are forming and the existing chapters, that we want to create that dialogue with the franchisor so that we can work together. joining together for that common cause of success in the franchise system and in franchising in general. I'll use an example from a couple of weeks ago. There's a newer franchise chapter that was formed, and the franchisor wanted to speak with me and a couple of the people forming the chapter.
It's good.
No, it's amazing. And I absolutely said yes, because at first I was warned that it might be a little bit of an angry dialogue. But when the franchisor came on, he actually said, I reflected on what we're trying to do here, and I do see the benefit, but I want you to explain how this could work.
Yeah.
And again, I went into my coaching mode, and I basically said what I said before about, you've got a group of people who are willing to help you.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, you can use this as a strategic tool to improve your business. So if you're looking at changing a system in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it might be, here's a group of people that you can leverage to test the system and give you real feedback, honest feedback, right? Again, going back to the concept, we all want it to work. As a franchisee, I want to be profitable and successful. The franchisor, of course, wants the franchisee to be successful. But again, as we had this conversation, he turned much more positive about how can he work with it. He actually said, what will this cost me to work with these guys? I said, no, nothing. They pay for their own membership. You just have to have an open dialogue. And we have other groups that meet on a monthly basis, and they actually send their chapter meeting notes to the franchisor.
I would love that if I was a franchisor.
Yeah, and then the franchisor writes back notes on the same thing, so that it's now an interactive dialogue between the two groups. And again, that's my vision of where I want to take the AFD moving forward. And not that Bob Pervin hasn't done that. I think lately there's been a lot of challenges because of private equity taking over franchise systems. That's normal business. I can't fault the private equity. That's what they're there to do. But at the end of the day, I think it's about communication, as we talked about previously. You've got to have an open line of communication, and you've got to be willing to hear each other out in terms of what you're trying to accomplish or what the needs are. There's always going to be contractual issues, right? It's a contract. They're not fun. They're not meant to be fun. They're meant to keep both sides honest with what's supposed to happen. Negotiations, ultimately, both parties should go away equally unhappy, but equally happy, right? It's about balance of needs. And I think that's the benefit of what we in the AFD are trying to accomplish, which is facilitating the interaction between franchisor and franchisee. So it's a positive experience and collaborative versus this animosity-filled discussion or angst. Again, okay, what are they going to do to me now type of thing? And I mean that on both sides.
It is akin to a marriage where people are signing a franchise agreement for 5, 10, even 20 years. So, and in a marriage, when you hit hard times, like you don't just like look right to the contract or whatever your state is. It's like, let's work through this.
Yeah, with coaches and mentors, right? If you run into hard times, you need someone to step in and help you through the tough times. It comes down to relationships. You're absolutely right. And whether it's a one-on-one relationship, business or personal, or a group relationship, franchisees versus franchisors, it's about relationships and those dynamics that create the good times and bad. And if you have a line of communication open, it makes it a lot easier to resolve any issues or questions or challenges that may pop up for either side, right? It's the nature of the beast in terms of communication. How can we leverage this to be more effective with this relationship that we have so we can both be successful? And to your point, be married for 30, 40, 50, however many years, that makes sense for the two parties. Right. And it is a marriage. You're agreeing to terms and you're agreeing to a relationship that at times is going to be challenging, whether it's imposed by a contract or imposed by COVID-19 or, whatever it might be. That's the value of having that communication. And again, mentorship and coaching and experience behind you so that you know how you might be able to weather a storm.
And I think the contract is important, but it's like in all the business relationships we have, it's like you only fall back on it if it's like a really kind of dire situation. It should be more basic, like where these are the services I provide you as a franchisor to franchisee. Yeah. You make money this way. You should be able to make money. And it's like, if these basics aren't happening, like let's fix the basics and forget the contract. We need to make sure that you have a successful business and the franchisor's brand's protected or whatever. Yeah. What are the most important 4 or 5 things for the franchisor, the CEO, executive, whatever, and what's most important for the franchisee, and just make sure that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the contracts have only gotten larger and longer and more legal, if you will. Like I remember when I signed my first one with Action Coach, it's probably about 15 pages. I'm guessing.
That's how
Even
the
the BNI.
license agreements are. Like I saw the
Exactly.
Starbucks license agreement, and it's like 20 pages. And you think for like such a crazy big brand, just a 20-page contract. But I mean, yeah, these FDDs with the franchise agreement, it's like now 300 plus pages, where it just seems kind of unnecessary.
Yeah, and again, it's unnecessary until it's necessary. Again, that's the blessing and the curse of a contract, right? It is meant to protect both parties, and
Yeah.
and sometimes it has to be engaged. Other times, ideally, you'd love to put it in the drawer and forget about it till the next renewal. Some franchise systems are that good, others are not, and it just depends on the influences on them. And again, I think a complexity with private equity coming in as much as they have. I mean, they see the value of franchising, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be involved. But that also creates complexity as well, because they have to protect their interests. And again, as a business guy, I get it. As a franchisee, I didn't like it. I have bias on both sides there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the private equity owner can come in where the prior owner saw it more as like a collaborative partnership, where the new owner sees it more as captive clients that have a 10-year contract and they have 8 years left and they have to pay whatever. And that is, instead of having a partnership, it's more of a client relationship.
Well, I compared it. I was talking to a franchisee one time, and I compared it to buying a house. There's those, I'll use generic terms, and there's that couple that will buy a house and they'll live in it forever. My parents still are still in their same house from when they got married.
Wow.
55, 60 years ago. They're still in the house. So that's that original franchisor, if you will, right? They bought the house. They believe in the house. They love the house. They're never going to get rid of the house until they have to. And then you have the ones that are just the house flippers, right? You hold on to it, you fix it up, and then you sell it because you're looking to make a profit. And again, there's nothing wrong with that concept. That is capitalism, right? The challenge is what happens in between. You have that original founder that had an amazing vision, and does that vision hold on as private equity number one and private equity number two and private equity number three come into play, right? And that's the downside, right? Things get lost both organizationally as well as the relationships. With that said, again, even in the BNI world, I think one of the benefits when Dr. Ivan Meisner sold the franchise system to the private equity was able to really globalize what was essentially a very good mom and pop shop type business. It was global, but they invested so much in technology and they invested very much in the processes behind it, which really elevated the brand.
We saw that with Domino's when Bain Capital bought Domino's, then it went IPO. Like, it was an amazing franchise system, but private equity came in. It was more that growth capital. I think that's a big difference, where it's like, what's the intention of the new owner? And is it to grow a lot of locations and increase the unit level economics, the profits, the top line revenue? Or is it more to, create an affiliated vendor company or POS software, and like, how can we extract more money from what we have? And so, which is easier? How do we extract more money from what is already here? Or the harder thing is like rolling up your sleeves and be like, okay, how are we going to bring this to the next level? And like BNI is a big thing in Brazil. I remember I went down there. People know about it. So that's a tough thing to enter new markets. And it's
absolutely. And again, I can't fault the first private equity group that came in, and they really invested in properly expanding and globalizing BNI.
Yeah,
and it actually set BNI up for success with the pandemic, because we had the technology infrastructure in place that allowed us to continue operating virtually. Now, again, BNI is a relationship, or you can't have virtual relationships for long, but in the scope of the pandemic, it worked really well. And it was a great stopgap to continue helping us as business owners continue to develop business through networking virtually. Again, it's tough to say anything bad about that because they did a good job with that.
What are some, besides like change of ownership and kind of just relationship issues, what are some one or two other items that you see come up time and time again in franchising?
In general, I'd say there's certainly some gamesmanship going on with the contracts. We've seen that repeatedly with franchisors. And unfortunately, the franchisees are stuck because a lot of times it's sign it or not, it's their choice. And it absolutely is. But these are individuals who have invested years of their lives and a lot of their personal resources to build a franchise. So, unfortunately, the contract can be one of those stumbling blocks.
And they're not like, I'd be curious to know like what percent of them are like accredited investors, like how the SEC has requirements of like, you make as a couple 300K, net worth $1 million, you become an accredited investor and you can enter into more sophisticated contracts, investments where
I have not been exposed to that one yet, but that would create an interesting dynamic.
A lot of these people, like they're not sophisticated at all, and they're signing a contract that's pretty damn sophisticated, oftentimes without legal counsel.
Yeah.
And it's like, it doesn't really make that much sense for a lot of these
people.
And
I'll say that's always the risk, right? And that's one of the lessons I'll say that I saw from some of my peers, as well as other franchisees and other franchise systems, that with all due respect, it probably wasn't the best thing for them to do in terms of buying a franchise, because they didn't have the skill set, nor was the franchisor able to provide the skills that they needed to effectively run the business. And I'm not saying I initially had all the skill sets. I had to do a lot of learning around the franchise system, having come through the corporate world. But I think people have to be careful when they enter these agreements, because when you're signing up for a franchise, you're basically buying a job. You really are. And I remember one of my peers saying that in BNI, right? You're buying a job, and you really have to understand what you're buying into. Now, I'm a firm believer in the value of franchising. It's a great opportunity to run a business that should be turnkey.
Yeah.
Right. Everything's been done, and you should have peers that are able to help you in the time of need.
You don't have to do the
again, it becomes a challenge.
Fit. Like that's the hardest thing, like going to market with a new product or service where it's already been tested, hopefully by hundreds of other people before you.
Exactly.
And you can focus more on client service and managing people.
And I'd say that, that's always the caution, right? And definitely speak with a legal advisor who understands franchise law. And that's certainly one of the services we provide to our members. It's an onerous contract with things that you really need to make sure you understand before you sign it. It's not just, well, that franchisee said it was a good deal, so let me just sign it. You've got to understand it. And even me going into the Action Coach early on, one of the reasons why I signed with Action Coach, besides the quality of their training, was one of my good friends who was a West Pointer. He worked with me at the corporate company that I was at the time. And he said he was going to do that because he was leaving the corporation as well. And I'm like, okay. We have similar backgrounds. So at the end of the day, I trust you. And then, reading through the contract and speaking with the attorneys, I did all my due diligence. But having him as kind of that first step into it, it helped me understand what was required. And obviously supporting each other through the process, because we both lived in Connecticut. And that was helpful.
Makes it easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard, any concluding thoughts? Most of our audience is made up of prospective franchisees. We also have franchisees, franchisors, but a lot of prospective franchisees. Any tips for them as they looking to get into entrepreneurship, potentially through a franchise?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, really take the time to reflect on your personal strengths and weaknesses, right? You've got to understand what you're capable of and what you're not, and you've got to be honest with yourself. And again, I'll my own experience, when I signed that Action Coach agreement, I had an amazing spreadsheet that reflected my plan to grow my business by hundreds of thousands of dollars in the first couple of years. It was an amazing spreadsheet because, again, as an engineer, I love spreadsheets and I could design it to say anything I wanted to. But my weakness was in the actual art of selling, right? Selling myself and the value that I could provide based on my experiences. Those personal strengths and weaknesses are critical to understand before you even consider a franchise system, right? Do you know how to run a business? Do you understand, finances, bookkeeping, sales, operations, all those pieces and parts? And if you don't, that's okay, right? Because I'd say the second bit of advice is surround yourself by people that are smarter than you. And I think that goes to leadership. Be honest with yourself, transparent and authentic, that you're not going to be good at everything, and that's okay. But if you find people who are good at the things that you're not, and that's what I mean by the people who are smarter than you, right? There's skills out there that I don't even want. And I remember sitting down in the first conference with Action Coach, they said, if you want to do social media, now this is in 2009, social media was newer at that point. If you want to do social media, hire a teenager. And we laughed. But back then, how true was that?
Yeah,
right. And so as a either current franchisee or someone thinking of it, be honest and find people that can support you either in a formal contractor perspective, right? paying them to do it, or someone who's a good friend that can help you get up and running, whatever it is. But just be honest and find ways to address your weaknesses, because that's the only way you're going to be successful in the long run. Because if you don't do that, you're going to struggle. And when you start struggling, that's when the spirals happen. And at that point, it's probably too late to fix. Or it can be fixed, but it becomes much more expensive later on.
That's really well said. And I think a lot of people are kind of pushed into the process, whether with a franchise broker or a change of job, that they feel like they have to get into something fast. So take the time.
Yeah.
And one thing that resonated with me is like, you don't want to be the smartest person in the room, like with the other franchisees.
Yeah.
Ideally, you enter a franchise system and you're really in awe by who your peers are. And you see yourself as, being a successful franchisee, but you don't think you're going to be like the top one in 3 years. You should aspire to building there, but it's going to take a long time.
And if you think you're the smartest one in the room, you probably have a lot to learn, right? Because there's always more that you can learn about what you're trying to accomplish, right? Learning is a lifelong thing. And that was one of the core values of BNI, lifelong learning. And I'm a firm believer of that. For my own studies, academic and professional, you've always got to be willing to listen and learn from those who have done it. And learning isn't always duplicating. Sometimes it's learning from their mistakes, so you don't do that, which is some of the best learnings to have.
Richard, if franchisees are interested in learning more about the American Association of Franchisees and Dealers, or even about your coaching practice, what's the best way for people to contact you, Richard?
I would say take a look at the AAFD.org website. It's full of some resources. There's a contact us page. That's probably the best way to reach out to us to learn more about either forming a chapter for your franchise system, or even just reaching out to me if you have some questions. I'm happy to answer questions in a non-coaching capacity for the franchisees. Again, I'm a firm believer that everyone has the right and responsibility to be successful. We've just got to find a way to get you there. So
yeah, I love it. Well, thanks again, Richard.
No, I appreciate it, Patrick.